This is the last session, as I've said, and we're trying to get to there, the larger view. There we go. And we're going to just try to look at two documents today, two very different kinds of documents, the letter to the Hebrews and the book of Revelation. You're probably used to these disclaimers by now, but these are fairly long pieces and much more, shall we say, substantive than I can really get into. I'm just going to try to give you some flavor for what they're doing and how they work. So let me start out with the letter to the Hebrews here. We call it the letter to the Hebrews, but there's certain things about this that are very odd. It does not have a typical opening. No author or audience are identified, so we don't know specifically who wrote it or to whom it was written. It does have a closing that sounds like the end of a letter. You might recall this guy Timothy, who was an associate of Paul's. He is mentioned at the end, or at least a Timothy is mentioned. As I've said, it's truly anonymous. Early church interpreters had plenty of suggestions. There are many people today that have made suggestions as well. Barnabas, Paul's early missionary companion, a guy named Apollos, who's mentioned by Paul a few times, is sometimes suggested. That there's even a book-length argument by a modern scholar arguing that Priscilla or Prisca might be the author. It's an interesting argument. Eventually, however, the ancient church tended to attribute it to Paul, in part because of that reference to Timothy. But I think the final word always goes to Origen, this guy we've seen a few times. He said, after discussing all these possibilities, as to the actual author of this letter, only God truly knows. It's been called the letter to the Hebrews because its extensive use of the Old Testament and its comparison of Christ and the Jewish high priest and other mentions of the priestly system suggest a Jewish audience, and a lot of contemporary scholars think that's right, but there are a few that think some more sophisticated Gentile community might be intended. Again, at the very end, the author says, "Those from Italy send you greetings," but even that's a little ambiguous. Does it mean that the author's writing from Italy, or that he's in a place where a number of Italian expatriates are present? You know, can't be sure. This is very difficult to date. If the Timothy mentioned at the end is the Timothy we know from Paul, this might be first generation or maybe very early second generation. The early church tended to see it as a first generation document, and there are still some scholars that agree with that, and others that lean toward a post-70 date. It's really up in the air. And as I've indicated, without a specific audience, the occasion's a little bit misty as well. There aren't a lot of internal clues, but the few that are there suggest an audience that had perhaps begun to doubt their faith. The author seems concerned that his audience might drift away from the message they had learned, and that they are in other places becoming dull or shall we say, less fired up by their faith. Whatever the occasion, the letter exhibits a sophisticated interpretation of the Jewish scriptures. And I'm just going to talk about three things that are going on in this letter. One, its use of rhetoric. Well, we talked a little bit about this before. Deliberative rhetoric is a style of rhetoric that's trying to get the recipients, the audience, to do something, to make a decision and undertake it. That's why, for example, we refer to state legislatures as deliberative bodies. They're trying to decide, should we raise taxes, should we pass this law, etc. Then we'll go into its typological interpretation of Scripture and say a little bit about the worldview, the Platonic worldview of this text. So this author uses the Jewish Scriptures to try and make a case, to make an argument that he thinks the audience will agree with, and then use that to motivate them to a specific course of future action. So here's an example. In chapter 11, one of the more famous passages, Hebrews provides a long list of biblical figures like Abraham and Moses, whom he holds up as models of faith. These are the kinds of people that we come from, and you should be like them. So after demonstrating that all of these people are worthy of imitation, here comes now the deliberative argument. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let's also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so deep, so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us. In other words, let's get back to being faithful like Abraham, Moses, etc. And he does this throughout the whole letter. Now, we've talked a little bit about some forms of interpretation in the ancient world and early Christian text, like allegory. Typology is a little different, but still a bit fanciful from our perspective, because we don't think this way anymore. But think of figures, characters, even sometimes Old Testament regulations as prophetic models or types that foreshadow Jesus himself or something he did. That's the dynamic here. And the letter to the Hebrews takes the Jewish office of the high priest and a very obscure Old Testament character named Melchizedek as models or types for Jesus. So early in the letter, Hebrews describes Jesus as, quote, the great high priest who has passed through the heavens. Okay, now stop and think about this. Was Jesus born into a priestly, let alone a high priestly family? No. So how do you make the case that Jesus is some kind of high priest? Where he's going to go with this is the comparison between the function of offering sacrifice on behalf of the people that you see for the Jewish high priest and Jesus' own sacrifice or offering of his own life for God's people. That's where he's going to go with this. But he's still got to make a case for why Jesus can be considered a high priest. And this is where he brings in this character, Melchizedek, whose name literally means king of righteousness. He presents Jesus as a high priest on the order of Melchizedek. And the author assumes that his audience know who he's talking about here. So a little background is going to be necessary. There's a curious one-line phrase in Psalms that Hebrews quotes, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." And that's his Hebrews starting point for making his argument. The story of Melchizedek is way back in Genesis 14. And so here's a brief summary. Abraham has gone after a coalition of kings who had basically kidnapped some of his people. He goes and defeats them, flees his relatives and takes a lot of booty. And this is where Melchizedek enters the story. He comes onto the scene and is described as the king of Salem, king of peace, and priest of God Most High. And Melchizedek blesses Abraham, and in response, Abraham gives Melchizedek a tenth of everything that he has acquired in this battle. This is the basis for now the argument that Hebrews will make. Now, notice this argument that the letter makes. Because Melchizedek is king of righteousness and king of peace, and does not have, quote, beginning of days nor end of life. In other words, the story doesn't say anything about his birth or death. Melchizedek, therefore, resembles Jesus, the Son of God. Okay? Doesn't strike us as terribly obvious, but that's the way he's reasoning. So Jesus is, in an odd or a typological sense, related to Melchizedek. He too is king of righteousness, king of peace, and without beginning of and end of days. And because Melchizedek blesses Abraham and receives from Abraham a gift, Hebrews argues that Melchizedek must be superior to Abraham. Okay, and that's the argument there at the bottom of the page that the letter makes. Now here's the really interesting part. Abraham is considered the ultimate ancestor of Israel, and therefore all of Israel's later high priests who descend from Aaron also descend from Abraham. But Melchizedek is not descended from Abraham, and typologically, Jesus is descended from Melchizedek. So Jesus is a high priest, not because he has the Jewish credentials, we would say, but because he has the credentials of Melchizedek. And that makes him, according to Hebrews, superior to Abraham and superior to any of the descendants of Aaron. And so this then allows for a comparison. The priesthood of Aaron is inferior to the priesthood of Jesus. Jesus is the heavenly high priest. He serves in a heavenly sanctuary, not built by human hands. Instead of offering animal sacrifices, he offers his own blood. And unlike the sacrifices of the Jewish temple, which have to be perpetually repeated, Christ's sacrifice is performed only once, and it's good for all time. And because Jesus is now a superior high priest, he's also the guarantor of a better covenant. And so this idea of a new covenant, a new testament in a sense, is at the heart of this. The followers of Jesus have a better covenant than what was available through Abraham. And this leads now to that typical call for action. Therefore, since we have confidence to enter the heavenly sanctuary by the blood of Jesus, let us approach with a true heart. Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering. Let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds. Some of you might have begun to pick up on that contrast between the earthly high priest and the earthly sacrifices versus the heavenly or the spiritual priesthood of Christ. And this owes a bit to the ideas of the Greek philosopher Plato, who lived several hundred years before the Christian era. But some of you may know that Plato believed that all of the material objects we see in this world are themselves copies of some sort of heavenly or spiritual prototype. And so for every tree in the world, there's a perfect heavenly tree that is the model for every variation of tree. And in Plato's philosophy, everything in the material world is ultimately less real than the heavenly ones, because everything in the material world will eventually wear out decay, die, vanish. Not so the heavenly prototypes. And so that's why Hebrews can describe the Israelite temple as but a sketch and shadow of the heavenly one. Jesus officiates in the ideal true sanctuary as the ideal, the true high priest. So Hebrews shows us an important step that what we'll come to think of as Christian theology takes. The influence of Plato on the early church is enormous. We're used to thinking about Aristotle as well, but Aristotle gets forgotten until reintroduced about the year 1000, 1100 AD. So Plato's philosophy really shapes Christian theology for the next 1,000 years. I'm going to pause there. There's so much more we could do with Hebrews, but I hope that gives you a flavor. Any questions about the letter to the Hebrews before we move into the book of Revelation?
So Perry, this is Eric Galloway.
Right.
Does some anti-Semitic traditions come out of Hebrews then, seeing as it talks about the old covenant dying away and going away, and is that anti-Jewish then?
Well, the anti-Jewishness that you find in some places isn't as obvious here, but I do think that when you talk about how your group's covenant is better than or surpasses the previous one, that lends itself to that kind of anti-Jewish rhetoric.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking contemporary to it, but I was wondering if it got used that way later on. It seemed like it would be good material.
It did. But as I said, I don't think the letter itself is as obvious about that as some others, like the Book of Acts.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. How about it? Someone else? Any other questions?
Perry?
Yes, Liz?
Is it possible that the arguments in Hebrews contributed to the supersessionist tone of Christianity, that we replaced Judaism?
Yeah, I think that's how it would be used by some later thinkers.
Okay.
Because, if you say that Jesus is a superior high priest and the guarantor of a better covenant, it doesn't take many steps to get to the idea that our group's understanding and our group's covenant has replaced the old one. Anyone else got a question? Okay, buckle up. We're going into the apocalypse. When I use these slides with my classes, I usually have these very dark, foreboding slides. I lightened it for your enjoyment today. Whoops. What happened here? There we go. Froze up a little bit. Well, the book of Revelation is, I would argue, the most misunderstood and often the most misused book of the Bible, primarily because people don't understand its genre or its historical occasion. And this is, I have to be honest, quite exasperating to me and any number of biblical scholars, because I think we understand the genre and historical occasion of the book of Revelation better than we do for almost any book of the New Testament. It belongs to a peculiar literary genre known as apocalypse. The Greek word is apokalypsis, an uncovering, a revealing, hence a revelation. There aren't a lot of examples of apocalypses in the Bible. The second half of the book of Daniel is one. and obviously the book of Revelation, there are apocalyptic ideas sprinkled throughout the New Testament, but nothing quite like the book of Revelation in the New Testament. I've just listed here a few apocalypses that were out there before and contemporaneous with the book of Revelation. Probably the most widely, most popular one for a long time was something called First Enoch. Enoch is one of these characters who's little more than a name in one of the early genealogies in Genesis, but it prompted this enormous apocalyptic literature. The Apocalypse of Peter is a good Christian example. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to walk you through it, and feel free to stop me if you want more detail. But typically in an apocalypse, think it's a kind of narrative where the main character, he's a seer or a prophet, claims to have been given some sort of special or secret revelation. And this revelation usually comes through a dream or a vision, or in some cases, the character is transported up to heaven. And that's, we get some of both here in the book of Revelation. Initial visions in chapter 1, and then in chapter 4, our hero John finds himself swept up into the very throne room of God. And from there, he is shown what is happening. These revelations are usually mediated by figures such as heavenly beings, angels, and they partially decode what's going on, not just for the seer, but for the audience. And the part that I think almost everyone recognizes as the most confounding part is that there's a lot of bizarre imagery and weird symbolism. And much of that we can figure out. Some of it is just kind of, shall we say, stock and trade apocalyptic material. One of the things, when you start reading this kind of stuff with some regularity, you understand that people who wrote apocalypses were reading others. And so they're kind of recycling certain ideas and images. And probably the thing that is most telling is that, with one exception that I'll name in a minute, these apocalypses always attribute the document to some figure from antiquity, like Moses or Enoch or Daniel. But it's always the case that that's a pseudonym. The real author is usually writing in the name of Adam or Daniel, etc., much later. It makes the predictions look like, oh boy, this guy knows what he's talking about, because he's making predictions that, from the real author's perspective, have already happened. The one exception here is the book of Revelation. Our author claims to be a fellow named John. Doesn't say which John. It's almost surely not the figure who wrote the Gospel of John. The theology, the language are totally different. But our figure was a guy named John, who was apparently well known to his audience. And we've talked a little bit about some of this before, specifically with Paul. So this will sound a little familiar. For people who wrote apocalypses and thought this way, the present world order has gotten so bad that God has appointed a time when this present order will be brought to an end, and that time is imminent. It's going to happen really soon. So the present age has become the playground of evil forces that are about to be overthrown by God. And this new age, it's called variously the kingdom of God, new heaven, but it always involves the replacement of the present evil powers with an age of God's justice and righteousness. The people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls thought this way. They believed that they alone would be rescued in the new age by God's saving grace. There were a lot of ways that different writers and groups could imagine this moment of divine intervention, what I sometimes call 0 hour. That's they don't use that term, but think of history as kind of counting down. All right, and when we get to 0, the new age erupts. So many of these texts speak of a coming anointed one, a Messiah. The folks that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls spoke of 2 messiahs, a Davidic style Messiah who would win the war against the forces of evil, and a priestly Messiah who would help restore the land of Israel to its proper purity. But there are other texts where Messiah is not needed. You get sometimes the Archangel Michael serving as God's agent, and some God just takes care of everything but God's self. There are lots of ways that 0 hour is imagined. For apocalypses, the closer we get to that moment of divine intervention, the worse things are going to become. Apocalyptic writers did not believe in the ultimate reformation of things. Things aren't going to get better over time. They're going to get much, much worse the closer we get. It will take divine intervention to save us. And they frequently call this period the period of the birth pangs, the period of tribulation, because they compared it to a woman giving birth. You know, the pain and suffering just before the new life. So our writer here identifies himself as a fellow named John, and he's writing from an island called Patmos, and he's writing to 7 churches in Asia Minor, and they're specifically mentioned by name. And right up front, it's clear that as he writes, something bad is happening. So here's a nice map. Patmos, you can tell, is a little island. It's not much of an island. Very few people live there. And he's writing to 7 communities here. Ephesus, we know, had been a place where Paul had spent some time, and he may have had circles of followers in some of these other places as well. Here's the initial revelation, okay? The very first line, the apocalypsis of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place.
Harry?
Yes.
We've been to Patmos.
I'm sorry?
We have been to Patmos.
Yes. It took you how long to tour?
Yeah, it was the Alcatraz of the Roman Empire. It was where the emperor sent real troublemakers. When the empire wanted them away from everybody else, it sent them to Patmos. And it's got an ancient port and a more modern port. And there are a few villages on it. It's not huge, but it's not a real tiny island. There's a monastery and a cave where it is believed that John had the revelation.
Mm-hmm.
The cave is big enough that it was being used as a chapel for worship on the Sunday when we were there.
Yeah.
And my suspicion was maybe a few of his hallucinations could have something to do with bad air.
There is a it's either the 3rd or 4th century Christian writer who suggests that Patmos was, as you suggested, kind of like a penal colony. Mm-hmm. The problem with that, Liz, is we've got nothing that can confirm that. It may be right, but it's more part of the tradition than anything that for which there's hard evidence. So it might be right. I think it's just as likely that John is on Patmos, not because he's been sent there by the Romans, but because he's hiding. He might be in self-exile because whatever's going on has gotten so hot he's had to leave.
I didn't think about that he was in hiding.
Yeah, that again, I can't prove that, but I think that's as likely an explanation as the penal colony. So he notice a few verses later, he says, John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia, grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come, and from the 7 spirits who are before his throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness. The word there, witness, martus, is the root of our term martyr. A martyr is a person who bears witness to some truth, even to the point of sacrificing their life. So he is the faithful martyr, we might translate, the firstborn of the dead and the ruler of the kings of the earth. Now, hear that in the 1st century or 2nd century, we'll say more about dates here before we're done, and try to imagine what's going on. He's making a claim about the ultimate power in the universe that resides in the one who was, who is, who was, and is to come, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the earth. How many of the kings of the earth know that this guy, Christ, is the real ruler? It hasn't been revealed to them yet, right? And here, right off the bat, our author makes it clear that something bad is going on as he writes. I, John, your brother, who share with you in Jesus the persecution and the kingdom and the patient endurance, was on Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. And he recounts how he heard this voice telling him to write to the 7 churches. And then I'm not going to go read all of this. This is one of the problems with something like Revelation. It's so text heavy. It's hard to not give examples. But he sees this figure, and the description of the risen Christ, which this is modeled after the description of God in the book of Daniel. Daniel has a similar kind of vision. That's an example of this kind of retreading of earlier apocalyptic imagery. Notice here what the risen Christ says. I'm the first and the last and the living one. I was dead, and see, I am alive forever. I have the keys of death and Hades. Now stop and think about that. John is writing to a community that is undergoing persecution, and some of them may die. The revelation comes from the one who was dead and is alive again, and now has the keys of the place of death. And some of you might know, I didn't include this, but traditional Greek Orthodox iconography portrays the resurrection of Jesus as Christ breaking down literally the doors of Hades. And in all of these pictures, there are keys scattered everywhere because Christ has unlocked the gates and is now releasing the dead. That's the idea here. Time doesn't permit me to talk about what happens in chapters 2 and 3, but there's a letter to each of the several churches, and there are lots of clues in those churches about things going on, in particular some form of hostility that's going around. So you might imagine being a member of a Christ community in a place like Pergamum, as this is being read out loud to you. And if you know John and respect him as some sort of prophetic leader in the Christ movement, then this is important stuff, and you're going to pay very close attention. Then we move into chapter 4, where John is taken up into heaven. And he gets there, and there in heaven is a throne, and he sees the figure seated on it. Well, this is obviously God. And again, I'm not going to go into detail reading it, but he sees heaven as this place where perpetual worship occurs. All of the heavenly beings, the angelic host, they are engaged in offering praise and adoration to the one true God. There aren't any predictions of the future. There are no instructions for moral behavior. What's been revealed here is the one true God and what proper worship looks like. That's going to be the primary issue in the book of Revelation. Who are you going to honor as ultimately God? The God of heaven or the Roman gods? That's the choice, I think, that is being presented to the audience. Right after this, we have the famous scene where a scroll is presented. It's got 7 seals, and the question is,
Gary, I'm sorry
Yes?
to interrupt again. This would be very treasonous writing to say that there's somebody above Caesar who should be worshipped. So I could see why
Yeah.
this, I mean, apocalyptic literature is written usually to people who are seriously oppressed, to encourage them to hang on, and telling them that they and what is right and holy will win in the end. And
Yeah.
so it's presented often as occurring far in the future when it's really meant for here and now encouragement, but it's disguised. So if it falls into the hands of the powers that be, those who possess it can say, well, this is obviously not about you, it's about the far future. But
Yeah,
this is very,
you're right. It is subversive, and we don't know what a Roman official would make of a document like this if it came before him, but it would provide, like you suggested, plausible deniability, right?
possible deniability. I like that.
Yeah. So notice this really interesting imagery here. Who's going to be able to open this scroll? And at first, no one steps forward, but one of these heavenly elders says to John, don't be upset. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. So now think of the terms: Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David. We're thinking of a powerful figure, a Davidic king. And notice, has conquered. He's already won. This, by the way, is not a coin. It's a royal seal from the 7th century, I think. Yeah, 7th century BC, from King Hezekiah. And it represents Judah. So the Lion of the tribe of Judah. This is the apparent kind of reference. And so John eagerly turns and he sees a lamb standing as if it had been slaughtered. Now the next slide, I apologize, it could be a little upsetting. It's meant to be because we've got a really jarring clash of images here. Lion, slaughtered lamb. What is John seeing? Right? Well, the lamb here takes the scroll, and all of these heavenly beings start singing, "You, the lamb, are worthy to take the scroll and open its seals, for you were slaughtered, and by your blood you ransomed for God saints from every tribe, language, etc." Okay? So, how did the lion conquer, win his battle? By dying like a lamb, by giving his life for God's people. And this is the really odd thing about the book of Revelation. It's got all of this, all of these images of violence and warfare, but you read closely and over again, the winners are the ones who died for God's cause. not the ones who killed for God's cause. Now, I'm going to jump over to chapter 12. John has this vision of a great portent in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet. She's wearing a crown of 12 stars. She's giving birth. Here's that birth pangs image. And there appears a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. Now, how many of you know what a diadem is? It's functionally equivalent in the ancient world to a crown. Kings and emperors wore them. So this is a big clue that the beast here, or the heads on these, represent kings. And one of the stock images you find in apocalyptic literature is these terrible beasts usually represent earthly kingdoms, or associate the power of these monsters with earthly kingdoms. A little further into the story, we are told that the red dragon is Satan. And you might remember the word Satan literally means accuser. In the book of Job, the Satan is kind of like God's prosecuting attorney. By the time we get to the book of Revelation, he's the adversary of God and the adversary of God's people. And so he is associated now with this dragon. And the angel Michael fights this beast and defeats it. So we get this scene of intense aerial combat, you might say. But then look what the story does with this. After the battle's been won, there's a refrain. The chorus is literally singing, and it says, the accuser of our comrades has been thrown down. They, God's people, have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life even in the face of death. So the real battle was not something in the clouds, so to speak, but was fought wherever God's people were killed for their witness. And when they died faithfully, they won. Satan was defeated. And then we're told that the dragon, the woman gives birth, God saves the child and saves the woman. And so the dragon storms off to make war on the rest of her children, who are specifically those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. So again, think back to that Christ community hearing this. John is saying, be ready. The beast is coming for you. And we don't have time to go into it, but chapter 13 is where I and most scholars think are major references to the Roman Empire. The Satan figure raises up 2 monsters, 2 sea monsters that we think represent the Roman emperors, and secondly, their officials, like their provincial governors. It's interesting, our earliest Roman document involving some persecution of Christians comes from the early 2nd century, a Roman governor called Pliny the Younger. He's the provincial governor in northern Asia Minor, not too far from the communities Revelation was intended for. And people get hauled in before him and are accused of being Christians. And he doesn't know what to make of them. But he knows that there's something dangerous or subversive about these people. So how does he persuade himself that people are or are not guilty of some crime? He has statues of the Roman gods and a statue of the emperor brought in, and he orders the people to make a minor sacrifice. He even says, say these words. It makes it really easy for them. And those who could not do it, he knew were Christians. And he says if they could not offer the sacrifice, refused after 3 offers, he had them executed. So that's, I think, something like the situation that some of these Christ communities were in. Maybe not that specific occasion, but something similar. Now, when we get to chapter 17, the author starts talking about the coming judgment of the forces of evil. And notice the real object of his wrath is this woman described as the great harlot or the great whore. It's very ugly, insulting language. It's meant to be. And notice how she's described. She's seated on many waters, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. And a little further, it describes how she's drunk on the blood of God's people, the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses. And here's, if there was any doubt, here's the big clue. What's her name? Well, on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of whores and of earth's abominations. The ancient city of Babylon was in ruins at the time the book of Revelation was written. It didn't exist as a living city anymore. And as we've talked about on an earlier occasion, the ancient civilization of Babylon had destroyed Jerusalem 600 years before the time of Jesus, and Rome had done the same in the year 70. So Babylon became a code word for the Roman Empire. And so there are other clues here in chapter 17 that make it pretty obvious that the great whore here is the goddess Roma herself. And this is how the Romans presented her. She's much like the Greek goddess Athena. She's a warrior goddess. She's the very embodiment of Rome. So notice, this would be a bit like someone, taking the image of Uncle Sam and saying, let me tell you what Uncle Sam really is, and just insulting the figure. If the Romans figured out who the great whore was, they would be very upset. And so the scenes of judgment involve the judgment of Roma, the whore. Satan is eventually defeated. There are these great apocalyptic battles. There's a scene where the risen Christ shows up on a horse and by the sword of his mouth slays the armies of Satan. That sword is interesting. Way back in chapter 1, when John encounters the risen Christ, he sees this sword coming from the mouth. And how far do we push that? Does that mean that this is a sword that hacks people to death, or is this the power of the preached gospel to, as it were, defeat the enemies of God? It's a wonderful image that you can think about in a couple of ways.
Or is this
yeah.
like Christ the Logos or Word?
Yes, but that term doesn't occur here.
No, the term doesn't occur, but I'm thinking what comes out of mouths? Words.
Yes. So after all of the defeats imposed upon Satan and his allies, then we get what the people that John is writing to are waiting for. The salvific vision. So in chapters 21 and 22, this is laid out in much more detail than what we can go into. But a new heaven and a new earth appear. And to our way of thinking, something odd happens. This new earth does not have a sea. Can you imagine a world without a sea? But the sea is in Apocalypse is the symbol of chaos and destruction. The beast that the dragon raises come out of the sea, kind of like Godzilla, right? A new Jerusalem appears, and God lives among his people and comforts them. And notice this. Imagine a community that has already known some suffering. and maybe has had some of its members die as a result of persecution. How would this powerfully speak to them? God will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. So the book of Revelation is a classic example of an apocalypse. These visions were designed to prepare Christian communities for a struggle with the Roman Empire, and it was telling Christians that they needed to be ready. Some of them would have to suffer and even die, but if they died for their cause, God's cause, Christ's cause, would triumph. Now, the date for this is interesting. There have always been some that suggest that this was written in the time of Nero, which would be in the 60s. But I think the majority view is that it's written a little bit later, probably in the early 90s, when the Emperor Domitian was running the show. Remember this guy Irenaeus, we've talked about him a few times. Irenaeus flatly says that the book of Revelation was written late in the reign of Domitian. I'm in that camp that thinks this is probably correct, and if so, it's interesting. Domitian's father was Vespasian. He was the general in charge of putting down the first Jewish rebellion. And when Vespasian left that campaign to go become the emperor in Rome, he left his son Titus in charge. Titus was the man who destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed its temple. And Titus became the emperor after his father died a few years later. So if you've been to Rome, you've probably seen the famous Arch of Titus. It celebrates Titus' victory over the Jewish people. Domitian is the little brother. Domitian was too young to be a part of the war effort, but he vigorously promoted the image of his father and his brother, now dead, but he presents them as divine. They are divine emperors and are worthy of being worshipped. And this is an image of Domitian. So we know from Roman sources, Domitian was a particularly cruel and brutal, ruthless emperor. There's one story told by Suetonius that Domitian took one of his slaves and invited him to dinner and just treated him lavishly, gave him the best food, lavish hospitality on him, and the slave and everyone is just wondering what's going on. And the next day, he took the same slave and had him crucified, just to demonstrate that he, Domitian, had the power of life and death. That's probably the face of the Roman Empire that our author, John, knew. But the book of Revelation, as Liz says, was meant to provide hope to oppressed people. Now, where it sometimes becomes problematic, what happens when the people that now read and treasure the apocalypse are not the oppressed minority, but are the political majority? Interesting kinds of complications arise from that throughout the course of human history. So how are we doing on time? Oh, we got a couple, 3 minutes. So first, any questions about the book of Revelation?
Perry, can you hear me? This is Bob Schilling.
Yes, Bob.
I wonder, when the canon of the Bible was being decided upon, was there controversy about admitting Revelation to the canon?
Yes. When we began to have conversations about that in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, Revelation was controversial. We've got in the early 4th century, I think I mentioned this guy before, Eusebius. Eusebius says that some people give the book of Revelation a lot of respect, but others don't. And what became eventually the canon of the New Testament was a little different in the East. Eastern Orthodox, some Eastern Orthodox communities, particularly in Syria, never accept the book of Revelation. So to this day, the Syrian Orthodox Church does not recognize the book of Revelation. So you're right, Bob. This one had a tougher time in some quarters than others.
I'm glad it's there. There's some of the text of Handel's oratorio, The Messiah, like "Worthy is the Lamb that was slain."
Yes.
There's
There-
some rich poetry there.
You're right. And one of the other things that, I probably could have done more with, there are a number of passages in the book of Revelation that are ringing with these poetic rhythms. And we suspect that some of this may have been snippets of material that were used in worship services, worship settings for John's community. So, that alone makes this, worth our time, right?
Right. Thank you.
Anyone else? Well, I want to thank everyone for being patient with me. I'm sorry, did someone try to
Mary,
ask
this is
something?
Liz again. In my fundamentalist background, Revelation was used as the basis for all kinds of predictions of what's going to happen in an end time and the tribulation and the Antichrist and all of that. It was taken very literally, and I now understand that as a gross misuse of the book. But this is a book that has caused a lot of trouble. I mean,
Yeah,
I think so. I mean,
Well,
well,
you-
that Left Behind series is based on
yeah, you're right.
those.
I've written about this, Liz, and maybe one of the things that Amy and I can do is send out a link to an article I wrote about 15 years ago. The Left Behind stuff has been around for better than 100 years, but it's based on some ideas that only come into being in the 19th century. And so this Left Behind stuff has, to my way of thinking, infected the church. And has come to dominate many of the evangelical forms of Christianity. But you'll find some Methodist, you'll find some Calvinist, buying into this. It's a rather, what's the right word? A rather disturbing trend. But I'll pass along that link. So folks, in the minute or so we've got, would you like for me and Amy to maybe in a few weeks send out some kind of survey, informal survey, to see what interest there would be for something like this again, late summer or early fall? Would that be something you'd enjoy having some input in?
A survey
Yes.
seems like a good way to do that because there's no way to do that now.
No. Did this work to your satisfaction reasonably?
Yes.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yes.
Yes.
Very much so. Very much so.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Terry.
You folks have been long suffering. You listen to me a lot, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, listen, folks, be safe. Hopefully we'll be safe enough to come back and worship together before too very long. In the meantime, be well and look after each other, okay?
Also, thank you, Amy.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
thanks, Amy.
Thank you
You're
both.
welcome.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, couldn't do
Appreciate
it without Amy.
No,
Very good.
no way.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye. Bye.